Hey, CK.
Hey.
Thanks for joining. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to meet in person. I got, it's so funny with I buy a lot of books. I come across a lot of stuff, and a mutual friend of ours, again, I think I saw on Instagram randomly. That's how I came across you, and I've tried to I only barely read. I basically read nonfiction.
Yeah. So
more recently, I've said, all right, let's start reading more fiction, maybe even poetry, stuff like that. So when I came across this, I'm like, all right, let me support a local poet and author here. And I was blown away by this, the vulnerability in this. So
Thank
I appreciate you coming on and talking about this.
Well, thanks for making me one of your first parlays into poetry. I appreciate that.
You, and before that was Robert Frost. That was
That's some tough competition.
Back in the day. Well, we did have to remember, I don't know if you ever had to do this, but growing up, we had, actually, one of the reasons I started this podcast was from a teacher, Larry Hines, back in high school. But he made us he had this thing called the fickle finger. Anyways, he went around, you had to learn Invictus, Invictus poem?
Yeah.
You had to memorize it, and then he would come around school, and he would pick you at any point. And I had to do it in social studies. I had to get in my chair in front of everyone, and that was a big part of our grade for public speaking class.
Did that sour your relationship with poetry? I feel like that was
it actually made me appreciate that. I had to study, I had to prepare, and then I had to just on the spot. I had to do it.
Yeah, that's a good attitude.
Even though I was scared as all get up.
Yeah.
I think those lessons came well after, though, looking back.
Reflecting.
Anyway, the reason, and there's a lot of different angles I want to go here, but. Yeah. Because everyone looks at this, the finished product here, wherever the camera is, we'll put this up. But this came out last October, right?
Yeah, October 11th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I think often gets lost is, especially, as a writer myself, it was a hard time calling myself that.
Yeah.
I know it was years and years prior where you actually start and the process. So this book is really a culmination of how many years of work, right?
A lot, probably close to 10.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if we'll go back to the publish and all that, but let's go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Do you remember the first time you actually started to write poetry, and maybe for this specifically, or just in general?
Yeah.
That starting point of being comfortable with yourself to write that.
Yeah, I do. I am really lucky that I got exposed to poetry really early, and I kind of have two big memories of that. The first being when I was really young. So my grandfather loved poetry. He passed in 2013, and the very last thing he ever gave me was a book of Emily Dickinson poetry, annotated. I have it on my fireplace mantle, and I have a letter framed by my desk where I write that he gave to me that I think is dated from when I was in kindergarten, and we would write poems back and forth on yellow legal pad paper, and he would send me really excited reactions about ones that I did and just encourage that form of expression. And so to have that super young was really helpful. And then we kind of did that through letters. And I remember you were talking about your poetry unit in school. I had one in middle school, which I think everybody's middle school is when a lot of trauma starts to ignite and things are going, parents are getting divorced and you're starting to like boys and, or girls or whatever. And that was the perfect time in my life for that to come up. And so getting to actually learn the mechanics of it, and on top of the foundation that I had from my grandfather. And then I've been writing ever since. So some of the middle school pieces are not in this book, but I have journals going back from those times, and I just never stopped. And now they sort of live in my notes app, but it was continuous. It was sort of how I found expression and where to put the feelings about anything that was happening to me.
I think a lot of it, this is just in general adults, not even going back to being kids, but are just scared to write down things because now it's out of our brain and it's become more real. Did you ever have fear of writing it down, or did you maybe not even think about it at that time?
I think almost the opposite. I think I really wanted to understand what was real. And so I think it was my way of making sense of things. And I often this is probably getting too in the weeds too soon, but I call my own bluff on this in my own writing a lot, where a lot of my poems are saying the same thing over and over again, and I love to point that out to people because it's just me trying to make sense of a single idea. And I'm if I say it this way, does it make sense? If I say it this way, does it make sense? And then eventually those things kind of come together and tell a story, but I'm writing it down to figure out which one of these feels real, and is that how I can understand it? For me, poetry is super literal. It's not abstract or sing-songy.
By the way, go in the weeds. That's why I do a long form podcast. I prefer the weeds. So you mentioned like learning in middle school, like the style. Do you keep that same style now, or have you adapted of how you like to write?
Yeah, I kind of feel like I do a little bit, probably a spirit of it.
Yeah.
I write pretty long form and pretty like rhythmically.
Yeah.
One of my favorite comments that I get sometimes is people will be like, "Oh, this feels like it should be a song," and I'm like, I don't have musical ability, so it is a poem. But yeah, I feel like those things were present back then too.
So when you think about writing there and kind of moving forward, and did you ever think you'd publish any of these things?
It was always my goal, right? Like when people say like, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I was like, author, all that, and then when I became an adult and like you start to have to make good on some of those goals and, you know, actually put your money where your mouth is, I was like, oh, maybe that's like more of a pipe dream, or like maybe that's not going to happen, and that's just like a thing that I say. Yeah. And then I feel like I'm 29 now, and I feel like in my mid-20s I went through like a lot of the things that I write about in this book kind of came to a head, and I was like, if I'm ever going to make this happen, like maybe I should do it now. Like I want to prove to myself that I can do this and put it out there. And it was sort of publishing. It was kind of part of the whole experience, like of what I was writing about, if that makes any sense.
No, and I want to go into some of that. Can you share? I think it might be really valuable because we all have these, you know, the kind of catalyst moments that happen, and you share this story about after this commencement speech, after this, where you met this father and I think a son. Can you take us on that journey there of how this kind of maybe triggered you to go in a different direction?
Yeah, I so appreciate you bringing that up because it's the one part of the book that's not a poem, and sometimes people skip over it. Yeah. And it is the intro to the book, which is a story about when I graduated from NC State, and I was a non-traditional student because I had experienced homelessness and food insecurity when I was initially supposed to go to college, and just a whole journey of getting back to school. And so I ended up giving the address on behalf of my department and talked about what that was like, and that was the most nerve-wracking thing I've ever done, to stand in front of people and share that story like out loud in the moment. And I had the father of another classmate, or somebody in the graduating class, I didn't know who they were, come up to me afterwards, and a handful of people did, and just like thanked me for sharing the story and like shared their own versions of how they related. But this guy in particular made a comment that I just never forgot, and he goes, my son has never gone through anything like that. Like, he's not that resilient. And I thought it was such an interesting take, because my point in going up there was not to be like, look how resilient I am. And I was very careful, even in like writing the speech itself, not to come across like, oh, look at my story. And like, it wasn't supposed to be about that. Like, it was kind of about how college is this sort of collective thing that we're all wading our way through, regardless of where we come from and like what that can feel like. And so for that to be what he took away from it really stood out to me, especially seeing some of the things that my classmates navigated. And so that was how I wanted to start the book, because I think we all have these moments, you know, it's titled The Floor of a Bathroom, where we find ourselves there. And it didn't necessarily have to be pinned up against like my ability to be resilient or not, or your ability to be resilient or not.
Well, and I think you shared, if I'm right, like you probably didn't go as deep as you wanted. Like, you weren't as vulnerable as you could have been.
Totally.
And I think this is apropos to probably what we see on social media these days, is like we see the best self of a lot of people.
Yes.
And unfortunately, we think, oh my God, they have the greatest life in the world. What am I doing wrong? And the reality is they're just the same.
Yeah.
They just happen to show the highlight reel.
Yeah, exactly. That's a better way to summarize it. You know, when I'm thinking about going up there and giving the address, I'm like, okay, this is really nerve-wracking. And I, at that point, had never posted anything online about it. I had never, you know, beyond like an essay in here and there, like written anything about that experience. And so it was my first parlay into like, how can I talk about the really vulnerable, hard things in my life? And it was just this packaged up version of it. And I was like, you can't really pin me and your son up against each other when you just saw this like really like packaged version of how I survived this hard thing. Like, there are other things that happened where I'm sure were more similar.
Yeah, I think we hear that word vulnerability, being authentic and stuff, and sometimes that gets overplayed, but the reality is, like, if you share your life experience, good, bad, or indifferent, most people can relate to that in a real sense, right? Everyone goes through shit.
Yes.
You know?
Absolutely. And what I found is like mentally, it really only takes knowing that one person does. That was sort of like the Band-Aid that I ripped off for sharing online. I think the speech helped. I definitely didn't do anything like that for a few years. It was a little jarring. And then I primarily share my poetry online on a regular basis, and then I will do events in the area when they come up. And like, you've read the stuff. It's, you know, about some pretty raw topics, like definitely more raw than that speech ever was. And the first time was the worst, and then it's never been scary after that. It's like the number one question I get asked is like, how do you share that stuff? It's like I have, you know, younger girls who DM me all the time who are like, I've been through that. Like, how do I share about that? You do it one time, and there is like one person who comes up to you afterwards and is like, me too. And I'm just like, oh, cool. Yeah. Like it's like, it's not embarrassing anymore. Doesn't feel like stressful or cringy or whatever it is anymore, because you're just like, awesome, one other person.
Yeah, and if you feel like, hey, I can lead maybe from just a little bit further ahead. I actually like what you said. One of the, I think the reasons you wrote, you said, I asked myself, if a younger version of me had come across these words, would it make me feel less alone? If it was yes, then I included it in these pages. Like, I just giving chills kind of reading that, because I was like, that's really cool. Like, everything can't go in. You can't have a 1,000-page book. I guess you could. It's your book. But like, what are going to be the most impactful things that I could share? How can I open myself up? Yeah. And in a way, it really helps someone else. So I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's true. That was the real criteria. I like sat in front of a Google Doc, like poem by poem, and was like, would that have been helpful, or would I have just been like, what is this girl saying? And just sorted them that way.
How often throughout the process did you ask friends for feedback or advice on what poems you should go in or anything like that? Or was this all just, I'm going to do how I want to do it?
Yeah. Honestly, it's so funny because in my normal work, I'm way more of the former. Like in my day job, I'm like a real like collaborative creative. Yeah. I would say more the latter on this one in terms of what to include. I think there was so I structured the book in different sections, and like I really wanted those to feel true, and it's really hard to get feedback on telling your story truthfully. Yeah. And so I did a lot of like technical editing from people, but I don't know that I recommend this, but I had very little creative feedback in this book.
Why wouldn't you recommend it?
I don't know. Because it's so opposite of how I do every other creative part of my life. Yeah. And I really value creative feedback and other people's opinions and perspectives. I think this was just a weird intersection of it, because I was like, it's kind of like a diary, and it's like, how do you get creative feedback on your diary? And I think I was okay with it not necessarily being the most like perfected marketing version of something. And I work in marketing, so like that was kind of hard. And that's probably like where the feedback would have come in handy, but I don't know. I did not.
I mean, I think you make it's an interesting point, because we are always told like, ask for feedback, get advice from people. But the reality is you got to do it your way. I mean, this is your baby,
Yeah.
Like at some point you have, because I think, if it was something else, if it was like you're doing an autobiography of someone,
right?
I could see the relevance there. But it's like, these are really vulnerable stories. Like if someone's like, well, you should cut that line out, or that doesn't make sense. It's like, doesn't make sense to you.
Yeah.
But again, going back to that one maybe girl that you can impact.
Yes.
It may make sense to them.
And that's like the best thing in the world. When there are like some random lines that nobody ever like, there's like the ones that I get a lot, and then there's the ones that probably would have gotten cut in an editing process that every once in a while somebody will send me a message on, and I'm like, yes. And I think feedback also depends on what your goals are. Like if my goal was to like really make it appear like valuable to the masses, or like if it really was to like, I don't know, do something like bigger on a marketing scale, like that was more general, absolutely feedback. I just kind of wanted to put out something honest. And I think I know that I'll write more, and I think I might go down more of a feedback-based path for that, but like it was very important for me to get this one out, and my only goal was for it to be honest, and I could do that by myself. Yeah.
Do you consider yourself then, and this is more of, I don't know if it's a technicality, but I'm kind of curious, like, do you consider yourself a writer over a poet? Are those different things? Are those one of the?
That's a great question.
I'm curious. I guess I've never
Yeah.
talk with a poet, so I've never been able to ask that.
I feel like people would consider them different things for sure. I don't really care what people call me, to be honest. And I'm a published poet, right? I've only written a book of poetry. I write other stuff a lot. So, like, I guess writer, author, I don't know. I like poet because I think it actually at first kind of turns people off. They're like, I don't like poetry. And then it becomes a conversation to be like, maybe you do. Like,
That was me.
What about
like,
this?
I don't know if I like poetry.
So I'm kind of into that, like a little more. I think when I write stuff in the future, I might stray away from poetry a little bit, but I'm flexible on the title.
Well, I'm just more curious, like, because sometimes you have like not the one trick, but like someone's like, oh, I only have to do this now.
Yeah.
This is what worked before. I have to keep doing it. Versus, no, I'm a writer. I can write different stuff.
Yeah.
Happens to be poetry this time. Maybe next time it's something different.
That's a great way I would say in that context, way more identify as writer. I think for a long time, poetry made the most sense for like how I wanted to understand the stories that I was experiencing, like talk about figuring out what's real. I was like, for some reason, it's coming this way, and this is how I make sense of those things. And I think that's kind of what being a writer is like you're experiencing the world around you and you're making sense of it in some way. And that does not always come in poetry for me. It did a lot for things that kind of fit the themes for this book, but I often write essays too. Haven't really done a lot of putting those out. I write some real long form stuff. I have big dreams of putting a novel out one day. But yeah, I think in that definition, writer for sure.
What is, I want to come back to this, but I'm going to take a slight side road about your writing process.
Yeah.
Do you have a practice you do?
Yeah.
No practice? I don't know.
I have a practice. It's not really glamorous.
That's what I want to hear. I want to hear what you do.
Okay. Very honestly, my best work comes if I take a little edible and I go on a walk.
Okay. Where do you go on a walk? Any walk? Is there
I love the Greenway in Raleigh.
Okay. So it's nature, some sort of foliage.
Yeah,
nature
it doesn't
that-
have to be, but I think like, it's accessible.
Okay.
And that's like, the ideas don't start there. I think normally I get little, like 1 or 2 lines, and I am constantly writing those down throughout the week. And then I do that, and I like revisit one, and then the rest of the lines will come.
Ah, okay. So you're kind of more of creation, and then there'll be some, I mean, you can almost say that's editing, right, a little bit, but you start with a creative here,
totally.
and then you build on it.
It's kind of the opposite. Was it Ernest Hemingway had the quote that was like, write drunk, edit sober? It's like the reverse of that.
Oh, right? Drunk edits sober. Okay.
That was Ernest Hemingway,
okay,
yeah. No, I think it's about just like, I think what I have found in general and sort of, there's a couple poems in this book that actually stem off this idea, is it has very little to do with like, I'm not like getting super high or like doing that, but it's the idea that feelings are really inaccessible in our day-to-day life. And that's more kind of what the process is about for me, is I don't necessarily feel when I am like working my 9 to 5 or even like socializing with friends that I'm like really sitting in my feelings. And one of the people this book is dedicated to was a therapist of mine that I had in college who like challenged that constantly. And he's like, but you're not like feeling it. You're not like sitting in it and feeling it. And so those walks are kind of a way where it's like, okay, you're sitting in it and you're feeling it. And there's probably an argument that like I could sit in it and feel in it a little more than that process involves, but it's the closest that I found that allows me to like write about it and connect with it without other noise. And I think you can really only make a good poem if you're super connected to the feeling that is like inspiring that poem.
Yeah. That's a great point, because I think a lot of folks have trouble just sitting in thought.
Oh my God,
and
I
just,
do.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the same way. It's like you have to put yourself in that situation. Otherwise, there's so many distractions. I mean, we have enough of them where it's like you can't even get down to say, hey, let me see what's going on. Let me muddle around with this a little bit and let's see what the output is. We never even get to the first step.
Totally. And that's actually part of where like making poetry a bigger part of my life came for me. I think when people hear that I'm a poet or they see my TikTok or read my book, they really expect me to be like a super like feelings, poetry, like is life, like let's talk about this rhythmical sing-song person. And I am absolutely not like that whatsoever. Like am like, I'm pretty career oriented. I am like very sarcastic and I'm joking most of the time. Yeah. And then this is where I get to like put those things. And I think, I don't know that that's a great strategy, but I think something I learned from this therapist was like, those things don't just go away. Like they either are like a really integrated part of your life, or you have a way to like honor them and feel them fully and process them. And I felt like I stumbled on almost like a cheat code to that when I started writing poems about the things that were going on, because I was like, okay, I get this idea. I do that first part where I write the line in my notes app, and then I do these walks and I like write them fully, and that's the closest thing I ever felt to like, oh, I kind of feel like that's settled. Like, give me another one. Like, give me another one. And I'm like processing it and like feeling it fully and like figuring out what it is. Like, why does that line keep coming up? Why does that memory keep coming up? Why does it? And then getting to like work through it, that feeling, and they all sort of get to like live in poetry, which feels just like the best, I don't know, like cheat code to sitting in the feelings.
Well, I think it's important, at least from what I'm gathering, to underscore is like you found a way for you, and it might be different for others, but
I don't know that I recommend that.
But I think the advice though could be broad of like, don't shy away from what you feel is natural to you and what you like to do, even if it looks unique or different or not normal to other people.
Yeah.
Oh,
absolutely.
You got to lean into that a little bit of what makes it right for you, and then that opens you up to who knows.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then I would add that like art can be accessible to you, even like you don't have to fit the like artist, archetype. Like you don't have to necessarily be that to whether it's like painting or poetry or whatever it is, it's helping with your feelings. Like those can be a part of your life and not, live and breathe that all the time.
Well, and I think too, this is top of mind because a buddy of mine I saw last week, he made a comment that I got upset at him because he's like, oh, I'm not, he said something like, I'm not creative. And I said, no, you're creative. You just haven't, everyone is, you just haven't tapped into what you're creative with, maybe it's spreadsheets or other stuff, is different than, you're not Bob Ross, sure, but like you have to tap into whatever that is. Right?
Yeah. Well, you make a really good point because like, I think I love creativity for emotional processing, but like people might use creativity for work and like a different part of their brain for their emotional processing, right. And that can like shape and form in so many different ways. And yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Talk about, so writing these in your notes app, keeping them by yourself is one thing.
Yeah.
Besides bringing this to the world, when you shared this with people close to you, how eye-opening it was them, how eye-opening was like, holy shit, you went through some stuff here probably. Like, did you get a lot of that?
Yeah. I feel like people that found out first or like heard first, I guess is a better way to say that, like they kind of know, like your friends know that you're, in a not so great relationship, or like your friends have kind of like picked up on like, oh, your childhood sounded a little weird from some of those stories, and then you're sort of like packaging those stories and telling them in a rhyme scheme and it's a little more direct and forward. And so I didn't get as much like shock and awe, but I got more like, I felt like my friends were really proud of me. Like they came to the performances and it was super special because like poetry definitely would not have been on their, to-do list for a Friday night, and like listened to me tell these things and I think had an appreciation for it. And I just got a lot of like, oh, I feel like I like understand that thing that I kind of knew a little bit about better now. And I think for the most part, like people's friends want to, like they want to understand them more.
How is the spoken word poetry, like how did that come about versus just saying I'm going to publish this in a book and let people read it?
Yeah. So they kind of came in the opposite order. Like book was always my dream, but when I write them, another way that I like to describe the writing is like the things that I kind of wish I said out loud in the moment, or like a lot of my poems feel like conversations, my side of the conversation in things. And so when I'm writing them, I'm like hearing them. I'm writing them to say them, and they definitely have that like rhyme rhythm quality to them. And I started seeing like other spoken word things online. Like I come across, there's a few like big channels that do them, and they would come across my feed, and I was like, I feel like my stuff kind of sounds like in that regard. And then like truly happenstance, I I work from home, and I was like at a coffee shop one day and was walking to the bathroom, and there was a bulletin board that had a sign for a poetry open mic, like 2 days after I'd had that thought. And there was a sweet, sweet, sweet woman named Debbie Johnson, who I love with my whole heart, who runs a group called Freshly Brewed Poems, and it was that group. And I went to it. It was at Larry's Coffee in Wake Forest. I don't think they do it at all there anymore. Or I know they don't do it at all there anymore, but it was awful. I did so bad. She loves to taunt me to this day because she like has the recording of it. She's very encouraging. She's like, but you've come so far. And I was like, oh, I'm never going to do that again. And then a year later, I saw them like pop back up on my Facebook page, and I was like, maybe I should try it again. And I did, and they operate at Tap Yard now. She would love if I tell you that it's every third Wednesday. And it's the sweetest group of people who come out and like share their poems and stories, and it's like the most welcoming, inviting place. And if I hadn't gone there, I never would have like done the other shows. And then people who do open mics know that like once you go to one, you find out about another one, and you could truly go to one every night of the week, even in Raleigh if you wanted to. So
yeah, just stepping out. I mean, this has come up a couple times today with like colliding into one another. Like you find these new people, these new venues, these new things just by stepping out just a little bit.
Totally.
Right? You're not jumping off the cliff. It's literally one extra step.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And what's the worst? It kind of goes back to that. What's the worst that happens? So you bomb, maybe, whatever that whatever that means. Most people forgot it, 2 days later or 20 seconds later, right?
Yeah.
Who cares?
I also think it's good. This is like a little bit of a side tangent on that, but I think it's a good thing to bomb creatively. I think like you learn so much like from doing that, and I'm very glad that I did. And then the worst thing that can happen is that, right, which is probably ultimately a good thing for your creative life in general. And now I have like friends that I've made through open mics who are some of my closest friends. I think it is an often like, I feel like you like see like there's movies about like open mic troops and all this stuff, and like it's kind of like parodied a lot. It is one of the coolest things I've ever gotten to be a part of as an adult, because I think the people who put them on are so wonderfully creative. I think there is not a lot of spaces, once you're out of college, where you're like encouraged to show up and try things and like be okay at it not being like perfect, and that those things that you're trying are like rooted in expressing yourself. And I just think there is like no place like that. And so I think people who can try them totally should.
Well, no one that's done anything what you would consider relevance. It's a comedian, it could be a professional speaker, anything. They all started an open mic. 100%. They all started a free workshop talking. Like, you can't start from being the top line best. You start from being crap.
Yeah.
And then build your way up and build your confidence and how you want to speak. Like, I don't know why folks are so scared to take that first step.
Yeah.
Because we've all taken a ton of steps, thousands of them, to get to a point of what we consider relevance. Yeah,
absolutely. And you're so right. It pretty much is like, whether you're a musician, comedian, poet, speaker, like there really is no path forward to like success in that doesn't include some type of open mic forum and just sort of like seeing what it's like.
Well, the simple, even from like a corporate standpoint, it's like raising your hand, right? If you raise your hand, you're the one that maybe gets the extra project or the promotion or whatever. And if you sit there quiet, typically that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And it's kind of just that raise of your hand in real life of saying, hey, let's just see what happens. I may or may not do well, but.
Yeah, that's so true. There's an Avett Brothers song that I love. Are you an Avett Brothers fan?
Not. I'm always looking for new artists, but I've heard of them. But
you live in North Carolina. You got to be on the Avett Brothers. But they have a song, and one of the lines in the song is, you got to show up if you want to be seen. And I always thought about during this, like, that line during this, because it's so true. Like, not only do you go and you get better and you make friends, but to go off of your hand raise and like getting the opportunity, I will do shows at like different places I did when at CAM or like bookstores, and those only came out of going from open mics. Like, not a single thing came from of that nature, came from like the online stuff. Like, that came from being in a room with somebody who saw you and was like, oh, I would like you to be in this other room. And like, this is a paid opportunity, or this is like a, sell your books opportunity. And like, that only comes from showing up. And so I think about you got to show up.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have certain ones you read each time, or do you kind of just pick and choose randomly?
Oh yeah, we got the greatest hits. Yeah, like yes and no. Not It depends. If I'm in a room where I know people have seen me a bunch before, like some of the groups that I go back to regularly, I go all over the map. And I love to do that because that's obviously more fun as an artist. Like you get bored of your own stuff faster than anybody does. If I'm in a room where I think no one has ever seen me before, which is like more often than not, I have like 5 that I know are really good entryways to my work. And that's sort of how I pick them. It is like, if you like this is a good representation of my work. And they're ones that I have memorized, so I can give like more like, you know, heartfelt performance to them as opposed to like sitting up there reading them. Yeah.
Do you, so I don't like this question because I get it a lot of like, Brian, who's your favorite podcast guest you've ever had? But do you have a favorite poem in this book? One that you kind of will reference often?
Oh, absolutely. It is one that I would say is in this 5, but it's the one that I do the least often. And it's one that I wrote that I actually almost did not include because I thought maybe, like a lot of these poems, if I had to like put them in a timeline in my life, sort of stop around at the very far end, like 25. So it's like really like for my life, like a 19 to 25 is like the crux of when a lot of the stuff is occurring. And there's one that I wrote in the same, like last year, because I turned 29 last year, and it's called The State of Being Alive. And 19 was like the worst year of my life by far. It was like the year that like my family's home got foreclosed, and I was, you know, experiencing homelessness, and like just all kinds of things were happening. Like you're figuring out what it's like to be in a vulnerable place and trying to like, oh, are you dating me for the right reasons? Like all of these different kind of like stories that I remembered from being 19 and how hard that was. And I had this moment when I was actively putting this book together where I was like a couple months away from turning 29, and I just realized how like wonderfully normal my life is. And like I paid a mechanic to fix my car and like went and got coffee, and like everything is fine and there's no stress about stuff. And I wrote this poem that sort of is like a conversation between like my 19-year-old self and 29-year-old self, just about how like, and it's not necessarily complimentary about my life now. It's sort of just like comparing how you can live these like 2 drastically different lives. And it just ends with the lines, you are here, you are whole, you are happy, you survived, you are comfortable with the state of being alive. And that is by far my favorite poem of the book. Wow,
love that. I wonder if that was one I earmarked a few of them. But the one, well, there's a lot of, like I said, it's a vulnerable, that was one of the more positive ones. I would say most of them are probably more the, like the,
it ends positive.
It ends positive.
Yes,
I think that might have been my favorite, the last one. Can I read it? Can we read these?
Yeah, whatever you want.
Or do you want it? Well, if you're here, why don't can you read the ones?
Yeah.
I think that's like I love this one.
Do you want to know something so funny? I almost didn't include that one because I felt like it was too positive. I was like, what if it's
But I think that leads maybe into now tell me, well, before you read that, quick question.
Yeah.
Because this kind of where I wanted to go is, how do you think about, it's kind of like, I think I grew up with like 90s rap music, you know, like Nas and Eminem and all that. And I'm like, they're not good now. They're good, but they're never as good as their early stuff when like they were raw and like whatever. So how do you think about that with your writing?
Oh, all the time. People make jokes about that to me all the time where they're like, when I started dating my boyfriend now, people are like, oh, but he's so nice to you. Like, what are you going to write about? You know, we're like, people, and I'm like, okay, well, we don't have to think about it that way. But I think I haven't really run into that. I have written like tons of stuff since this came out that I don't know. This is probably a terrible thing to do, like from a marketing perspective in terms of like putting all your material out there. I just like post things as they come to me and like, cause I like to engage with people that way. And I still write about some of these things, right? Like your childhood never leaves you. Your past experiences never leaves you. I just find them like, I find myself writing about them from a different lens. Like now I'm writing about them as a 29-year-old as opposed to a 25-year-old. And like, I think there are ways in which we realize like things stay with us, or we, like you said, how the lessons that you pulled from the poetry unit that you have, like maybe that's more something you have now than you did then. I find myself like learning different lessons from things. And so, you know, these are all things that have happened. They're never going away. And like, I also like writing about positivity. So the one that you asked me to read is one that was like I almost didn't include it from a theme perspective, but I really wanted to include it, and I'm glad that I did.
Yeah.
And it's actually a little homage to my friends especially my friends who we actually just celebrated our 8th year doing a Galentine's Day celebration together.
Nice.
So we've been friends for a long time. They knew me through almost all of the things in this entire book. And it's supposed to be an appreciation for the way that, like, you don't really get saved from things in, like, big ways. Like, people don't come and, like, when I was 19 and going through a lot of the, like, really hard stuff, like, and I think a lot of kids think this way. You're like, oh, my God, something is going to come along, and, like, I'm going to win the lottery, or I'm going to meet somebody whose family takes me in, or I'm going to, like, do this stuff. And, like, it just, like, isn't how, like, life works whatsoever. And I think this poem for me was a way of really appreciating, like, the tiny ways that you do get, like, rescued in your life. And it's, like, through people who are like, oh, like, my apartment had black mold one time, and I had to move out really suddenly, and people were like, oh my God, you can do laundry at my house, you know? And, like, that's, like, a way that people come in. Or, like, I write about there was a time where I went through just, like, this really awful breakup, and my friends planned a camping trip, and we went, and it started hailstorming immediately, and we were, like, holding all the stuff, and I have these videos of us just, like, laughing, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of a way that you get rescued. Like, you have these moments where, like, things are not perfect, and so that was, like, what this was, and I felt important to, like, cap the really heavy stories with that.
Yeah. I think the support network is there. Anyone that says they did it themselves is lying. Like, they've misremembered a lot of situations, because I think the support network, whether it's a mentor, whether it's a friend, it doesn't matter. There's so many different angles, but and sometimes too, I think about this is you have these folks that you've known for a lot of years and they're cemented, and then you have these folks that just jump in like a little bit and then they leave, maybe don't talk to them again, but they did some sort of help. They fish you out of some situation.
Totally.
You know, so I think we have to rely on others to get us to where we want to go. I think it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like what you said, anybody who says they did it by themselves is completely lying. And I think stories can be deeply personal and individual and emotional, and, like, you wouldn't really be in a place to tell them at all, like, if there wasn't some kind of, like, support network. And I am my support network's biggest fan. I love all of them so much, and, like, the fact that they come to my shows, or the fact that I had stories to write about in this poem, like, so much gratitude for that.
Okay, let's read this, and then I'll get you out of here. We'll final on one question after.
All right. I will preface that the rest of the book goes through sections. We're talking about, like, substance abuse and mental health and trauma, and then we end with this, so it's not, all so happy. But it's called The Ones, and it goes, find the arms that stand with yours, who make you laugh a little more, who tell you what you need to hear, who always leave an open door. Find the ones who you could call in your darkest seconds, the ones who don't use words as weapons, the ones who offer you a place to sleep, who will talk to you and get a little deep. The ones who let you do laundry at their house, the ones that you feel comfortable around. Paint the walls with them, and then the town. Thank the stars for all the love you found. Know that family is chosen 100% of the time. I am yours, and you are mine. Know that when you find them, you deserve it. And tell the ones that might not have heard it. And tell the jokes, laugh so hard you choke, sit on the porch, stay up with them in the dark, allow them to make things a little less hard. Take their calls, go on walks, the love that you can share is all that you got. Go camping in a storm and experience the hail as a group. Tell all the stories of what you've been through. Watch the sunrise as many times as you can. Share with them your future plans. Lay on the floor and share memories from the previous night. Allow yourself sometimes to fight. But always come back to the bond. The ones who come back with you, those are the ones.
I love it, CK. Thank you. Let's end on this.
Okay.
Because folks listening to this are in a similar boat. They're career focused. Maybe they have kids, maybe they're married or not, whatever. But everyone inside them, I know I've talked to a lot of them, they have something they want to do, but for some reason they haven't started. So you made a decision to say, I'm going to branch outside. I'm going to try something. I'm going to get vulnerable. what advice would you share? Maybe it's a question they should ask themselves. Maybe it's a challenge. What would you share to help them get started?
I love this question so much. I think the one thing that prevents a lot of people from doing the thing, especially if it's something that involves being out in front of people, right? If like you want to go play guitar or write poetry or whatever it is I don't think we spend enough time dealing with our feelings of shame. And so I think the absolute best thing you can do for yourself is to like think about shame and how you carry shame and like really get comfortable with that. And then when you like feel ready for it, like start to break down your shame a little bit. I think the best thing you will ever do for yourself, I saw this video when I was like really thinking about if I wanted to ever do my first mic or post my first video, and it was about people's biggest regrets later in life. Like when people are actually on their deathbed and they're 100, like what do they say? And the number one thing by far from this video, I don't know if it's like true for everyone, but from this particular video that I saw, was that people wish they had put themselves out there more and not like cared what other people think. And I saw this other discussion that kind of stemmed off this video that was like, you shouldn't not think about the people who are judging you when you're doing stuff, but actually like actively think about them. Like think about the fact that like, you know, maybe you have like an ex-girlfriend out there or somebody who was mean to you in high school who's like watching you do this podcast and sends it to their friends and is snarky about it, you know? Yeah. And it's like, yeah, that's probably happening. Somebody probably did that with my poetry, and that's fine. And I am still a happier, more fulfilled person for doing that and putting it out there and like actually getting to express myself and work through it than I would be if I let those feelings of like shame or fear hold me back.
Yeah, I love that. Because I think, and actually, if people haven't read this, I read it probably a couple times a year as Roosevelt's Citizen of the Republic, you know, the Man in the Arena speech. And it's kind of like, who are you getting your advice from, and who are you taking the criticism from? If they're not in the arena, if they're not trying things, why are you putting so much weight on it? Yeah. And that's a question we should all ask ourselves, I think. Yeah, and I think there's so much freedom that just comes in like assuming they are. Like, yeah. Yeah, they're not thinking. Most people aren't even thinking about what we're doing anyways. Or even I'm almost saying the opposite. Like, people totally like take clips and send them to their friends and make fun of them, right? Or like people do stuff like, okay, they probably are. And great. And I still like got to publish a book, and you still started a podcast, and like there are so many things you can do. And I think just like instead of trying to convince yourself that like people are always like going to view you in a certain light, just be like, yeah, they probably are. They're probably making fun of me, and that's okay. So why not? Yeah. And then to me, that's like the most powerful frame of thinking for like putting yourself out there. Yeah. Love that. Okay. So obviously the Floor of a Bathroom. Yeah. Poems by CK. Yes. Where do you spend the most time online? Do you any social channels that you frequent? Yeah, TikTok for sure. I am the most active for poetry, and just highly recommend if you have like a creative outlet to just like get yourself on there. But I'm ck.poet on both that and Instagram. Awesome. That's where you find me. CK, this was a lot of fun. Thank you for coming in and having this conversation. Yeah, absolutely.